Hey everyone, Tim Wright here, along with Dr. Michael Gurian. We have been doing the Wonder of Parenting podcast for a couple of years now, and we thought, let's try a couple Zoomcasts, and let's talk about important things together and see if we can get some guests on with us. So Michael, hello to you. You're up there in Spokane.
Yep. Hi, Tim. Hi, Tim and Tim.
And I've also got along with us a good friend of mine, and he and Michael really kind of met sort of officially for the first time today, but they have known each other. And this is Tim Madigan. And Tim, you're where right now?
I'm in Fort Worth.
Fort Worth, Texas. Is it nice, hot, and humid right now?
It's summer in Texas, and it's definitely all of those things.
So the reason why I asked Tim to come on, and let me tell you a little story of how Tim and I connected. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine recommended that I watch a documentary on Mr. Rogers. And I was not a guy who, my kids didn't watch Mr. Rogers. Somehow we sort of missed that phase. They watched other things. But I was certainly aware of Mr. Rogers, didn't know much about him. But I watched this documentary. It was a PBS documentary, I believe. And I was really moved by it. And one of the stories that moved me the most was a story of a guy named Tim Madigan, who was a reporter who was called upon to do a story on Mr. Rogers. And out of that, he wrote a book called I'm Proud of You, My Friendship with Mr. Rogers. And so I ordered the book, and I read the book, and was just grabbed from the start to the finish, in part because Tim's a great writer, because it was a great story, and because it spoke to one of the things that Michael and I have talked a lot about, and that is this deep need that boys in particular have for a blessing or affirmation from their dads. And Mr. Rogers played that role somewhat in Tim's life. So I read the book, and I wrote to Tim, and I said, would you be willing to come to my church and be interviewed by me and tell your story? And he said, I know you. I've been to your church. And his uncle was a member of our congregation. And so we brought Tim in and set him up on a couple TV stations to do his story. And then he did a couple things for us. And in the climate we're in right now, not only with this pandemic, but all the things that have been happening around the death of George Floyd and people talking about racism and what it means to be humans together. Mr. Rogers is a guy who comes up again and again as someone we talk about who gives us some guidance in this. So Tim, let's start with you a little bit and just give us the story of how you met Mr. Rogers, and then I'll kind of get some questions out of you, and then we'll deep dive a little bit in what he might say in our world today.
Yeah, sure. I met him. I'm a journalist and worked for a newspaper for many years, and I met him in the fall of 1995 working on a story about violence on television and how it affected children. And so our first encounter was on the telephone, interviewing him, and it was a long interview. He's very generous with his time, and he explained to me how he conceived his program as kind of an antidote to a lot of the really crappy things that are on TV that passes for children's television. And towards the end of the conversation, he said to me, Tim, do you know what the most important thing in my life is right now? And I said, well, Mr. Rogers, we just met. How could I possibly know that? And he said, speaking to Mr. Tim Madigan on the telephone. And there's something about the way he said it where I knew he was being absolutely genuine. And I think that I like to say that moment kind of speaks to what I consider to be the foundation of his human greatness, which was his ability to be present to people, and present to life. And when he was with you, he kind of came to you completely without his own personal agenda, and was willing to take in whatever it is you wanted to share and then respond from that beautiful sacred place of his with compassion, love, wisdom, and never judgment. That conversation went well enough, I suppose, that I was invited to Pittsburgh to spend 4 days with them and do a profile on Fred himself. And so I had an opportunity not only to interview him and watch him film the program, but to see this kind of how this presence manifested with everyone he met. And it was a truly extraordinary was truly an extraordinary experience. And that was in the fall of 1995, and then we became friends. He invited me to be his friend, strange as it seems. And so after about 6 months of corresponding, and one of the things about Fred was, there's a real risk in being his friend in that he wanted to know what was beneath the surface. He wanted to know about the things that you didn't feel comfortable sharing with other people, often painful things. So after 6 months of corresponding, I wrote him this letter and I said, "Dear Fred, I'm really glad to be your friend, but if we're going to be friends, I think you'd be the first to agree that you need to know the truth of my life." And so I told him about the life-threatening depression that I've been suffering for years and problems in my marriage and self-esteem. But I said, at the heart of it, Fred, is this haunting notion that all of my life, and this is something you allude to, Tim, that all of my life I've been trying to get my father to be proud of me. And for whatever reason, I've never felt like I succeeded. And so in this letter, I said, I have a question to ask you, Fred. Would you be proud of me? And for whatever reason, I mailed it away. And a few days later, I had his reply on July 1st, 1996. Dear Tim, the answer to your question is yes, a resounding yes. I will be proud of you. I am proud of you. I have been proud of you since first we met. And he said, I'm deeply touched that you would care to share so much of yourself with me and look forward to hearing all that you would care to share in the future. And then another time he told me, your trust confirms my trustworthiness. And he also said in this reply that nothing you could tell me could change my yes for you. He spoke in these unequivocal terms. Nothing you could tell me could change my yes for you. Anything mentionable is manageable. And so from that time on until he died in 2003, we had this very intimate relationship and friendship that was the basis of the book.
It is such a great story. And I want to tease out with you a little bit in a moment some of the things, insights that you learned from Mr. Rogers that may be helpful for us as we navigate our way through these days. But Michael, you had the opportunity to watch the show with your kids, and I'm guessing, knowing you're probably watching it with the Gurian mind and how it is that he's teaching and what it is he's saying. What were some of your observations about Mr. Rogers and why it is that his legacy still lasts to this day? I mean, after all, he did a kiddie show, right? What is it about Mr. Rogers and his unique way of talking to kids and his unique message that still resonates to this day from your perspective?
Well, your point about it being a kiddie show or a show for kids, I think is a really important point in that it's getting people when they're young and impressionable, and so it sticks with them, and it sticks with them for life. His I know it certainly stuck with my kids, and I was watching it over their shoulders. I was an adult, they were the kids, because of course when I was a kid we didn't have Mr. Rogers, so I was watching it over their shoulders, and so I was struck by a number of things. One was the way the messaging was done. It was done in a really child-friendly way. It was relatively slow, which is actually good, for that learning brain, for the brain to imprint it and learn it and take it in and process it, and then therefore take it in with gravitas and with joy, because he had a lot of joy. And then that imprints. And so I think the slowness of it, the way he talked, was really, really a neat thing. And then of course, the second thing is he would take on themes as you, Tim Madigan, were referring to, and you, Tim Wright. I mean, you're both referring to the fact that he would take on a theme. He would have a person on to the show and talk directly to them. And kids are real direct people. Like, they really grab the directness. They don't need a lot of other stuff. He's talking directly to a Black person. He's talking directly to a woman. He's talking directly to, various people who are timely, the issues of the time. And so the kids could identify with these people. These were quote unquote ordinary people, for them, and they could identify. And it's a conversation between adults they could identify with. And I think the third thing I would pull out of it is the attention to detail, even in the puppets and his crew, his team, and I don't remember their names now, but what was her name? Lady, do you remember, Tim?
Lady Elaine, I think it was.
Lady Elaine, yeah.
Something like, yeah, that's what it was. Yeah, I had two girls, and they could identify with that, and the puppet work, was just simple enough and yet direct enough. It was multi-sensorial enough, so that it wasn't just talking heads. They were actually interacting. There was action in the puppetry, but the themes were woven in. And I think for those young minds, it was a great way to reach those young minds. And it probably wouldn't have worked for like someone like me who talks fast, it wouldn't have worked. It worked, I think, because of the way he talked, the manner he had, the slowness and the gravitas of it, but the smile on his, face and the smile in his eyes, just that combination really, really worked. And the inherent kindness and goodness and humanity came through.
Yeah, good. I for anyone who's interested in Mr. Rogers, certainly I want you to read Tim's book called "I'm Proud of You: My Friendship with Mr. Rogers." And then I just finished up this biography by Maxwell King, which is quite in depth, and everything, Michael, that you talked about, he walks through. So your observations were spot on. The attention to detail, the simplicity of the puppets, and yet the power of the concepts that they would talk about, and later in his career, how he would spend a whole week on a big topic like divorce to really help kids deal with it. But Tim, in your experience with him, you had a chance to see that this wasn't a show, this wasn't a persona, this was Fred Rogers, the real Fred Rogers, and we just saw him on screen. And what were some of the character qualities of him that you saw in him that really speak to ways that we can treat people today in our society?
Well, I would add one thing to what Michael was saying, and it goes back to what I said initially, and all those things are true. Even though it was slow, he agonized over every word and every gesture in that film. It was very, very intentional. But the other thing he said to me once is that what he literally tried to do was to look through the lens of a television camera and make eye contact with every single one of his viewers individually. And he always spoke about his audience in the singular. It was always neighbor, not never neighbors. Mm. And I think that too was a big part of it. The other thing was, in terms of who he was, and I think that what became pretty apparent in our relationship and some of the things that he and I walked through together was he was obviously a person of tremendous compassion and non-judgment, and when he would always look to when people were behaving in ways that were considered injurious or wrong or mean, rather than judge that behavior, what he wanted to know was what was it about a person's past or a person's history that would cause them to act that way? What were the wounds that were being manifested by any given behavior? And it was like he took that tack in every scenario that I was exposed to, and so it was his compassion and wisdom and presence that were, and it wasn't. And again, all of us, I think, can be those things or aspire to those things and practice those things at times. But it takes some discipline and some intentionality. For him, I just think that's who he was. And so then, it begs the question of where would his mind and heart be now?
Yes.
And I think that another thing that I think is very important to remember about him is that he's a deeply spiritual person. Right. And his definition of God was my favorite all time, which was, there's a loving mystery at the heart of the universe that yearns to be expressed. And I think that with all the upheaval, with all the suffering, with all the pain that's going on now, I think that he would always be in touch with the loving mystery as it has been and continues to be expressed, not through, the more tragic nature of things, but how these many, many millions and millions of expressions of concern and care and decency that have been occurring, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the protests after the death of George Floyd.
What you said about how, rather than judging behavior, he would ask, what's the hurt behind that, or the wound, which is such a deeply gracious question that says that one of the really unique things that he was able to bring to the table was to see beyond behavior to the person himself or herself, and try to love that person into goodness. I'm putting words into his mouth, but he wouldn't try to condemn so much as try maybe to redeem, to use a religious word, and bring the best out of people. Was that your experience of him?
Well, it was, and I think that he operated from the premise that I don't know to the extent to which he understood his own power, his own power to heal, his own power to. I'm not sure that he understood his own, that by virtue of his presence, that he was healing people, and I think that whether or not he would choose to articulate it this way or not, he would say the way to redeem people is just to be present to them and not judge them, and to walk with them, and to try to understand them, and then if that person is redeemed or not, it's kind of, who knows. But his kind of imperative was to bring those qualities into both his television program and into his day-to-day life, and into his adult relationships like the one he had with me.
So, Michael, when you were watching as a dad, what do you think? What were some of the lessons that you saw from Mr. Rogers that your daughters were absorbing, whether they realized it or not? What were some of the key learnings you were getting out of what he was trying to do?
Well, of course, we're going back 20, 25 years, so I'm not going to have total accuracy, but I think I some things are coming to me in memories, and then in listening to Tim. One thing that I know they got was the sense of neighborhood. And I'm really glad you brought that up, Tim, this concept of neighbor. And I think that I've both theoretically and personally, I've always felt that kids want to be raised in a three-family system where they have a nuclear family, an extended family, and then more of a larger communal family. And neighborhood is involved in that. And so I think that did create safety for them as children. And part of why they enjoyed watching it, and we as parents felt great about them watching it, was that there was the sense of neighbor. And so it fit the value of always being enclosed in family, whether it's first, second, or third family, just being enclosed in family and having the safety of that, having and what they're doing, what they're archetypally projecting when they're watching is this safe, comes off as almost saintly man, who they can project into. And so in their internal, when they're dreaming, when kids are dreaming or thinking or processing, and it's subconscious, part of what they're doing is projecting towards someone like him and asking questions of someone like him, and he's a part of their neighborhood. So I think that was, I'm so glad you brought that up, and I think that's a big deal for them. And then also the compassion and non-judgment. He definitely came off as compassionate.
Yeah.
And even when he wasn't, even when he was doing puppetry or something else that wasn't specifically compassionate toward a person who was hurting at that moment. His approach was so compassionate, so it was a great model for the kids. It slowed them down, I think, so that they could be thinking of how to be compassionate, you know. And part of what was inside that is going to be non-judgment, and I think that's a crucial theme you brought up. I haven't talked to my kids in many years about Mr. Rogers, but I do remember when Gail and I went and saw the film, which was actually, that was only a year and a half ago, there was a film with Tom Hanks. And our kids went and saw it too. And so then we were talking to them on the phone. They live elsewhere, but we were talking to them about it. And that theme came up of how he had a way, almost a bodhisattva way, you know, which for folks who don't know that's that very compassionate person in Buddhism who becomes like a spirit and wants to come back and help others. He had that sort of saintly or bodhisattva way of not being judgmental. And while our kids know that judgment and value judgments are crucial, you have to have that. Moral judgment is crucial. He helped them, I think, and one of them said this, helped them to at least not be reactively judgmental. And that's what they took away from it. You know, and that's a pretty neat gift to give, to just stop them from a little bit of reactive judgment.
Yeah.
You know, that's good.
That's fascinating. I think one thing that I really came to appreciate about him, and maybe you saw this, Tim, when I was reading the biography on him, is he had a really amazing sense of humor, and he could laugh with the best of them when people would spoof him. And apparently he had quite a remarkable little encounter with, I just lost his name, the guy who played Beverly Hills Cop.
Eddie Murphy.
Eddie Murphy. And he would spoof Mr. Rogers on Saturday Night Live. And apparently they met, and Eddie Murphy was just overwhelmed. It was like meeting God, you know, and Mr. Rogers was gracious. I saw a clip of Mr. Rogers on Letterman, and he just handled himself. He had such a great sense of humor. And I think that's probably what helped make him who he was. Did you get a chance to see some of that?
Well, I did occasionally. He was really quite a nerdy guy.
Huh.
He was used to, when I would crack some joke, he would say, "Oh, Tim, you're such a card." And who uses that phrase anymore?
Right.
He really was. I mean, and only he could probably get away with it. So we didn't do a lot of yucking, I will say, but he did have a sense of humor and a playfulness about him. There's one point about judgment that I think it's important to make, though. Fred knew that there was such a thing as inappropriate behavior.
Mm-hmm.
That you needed to take a stand on or do whatever. There is and there were cases in which, that I came to find out about later, where Fred would encounter something someone in his circle would do, where he would very firmly say, "No, that's not okay. You can't do that. It's not acceptable." But he would say so without the kind of overriding sense of resentment, hatred, kind of the more poisonous human emotions that went with that.
Right.
He would just say, "No, that's not acceptable. I don't hate you. I love you, but that's not acceptable." And
Wow.
so I think that there's an important distinction to be made. He would never judge you as your being, but he would say, "No, that's not okay. It doesn't mean I'm not proud of you, but that's not okay." And I think that in this world particularly, I think the world would be a lot better place if we could set our own boundaries in terms of what we're willing to accept culturally or personally, without the kind of extra stuff, the hatred, the angst that goes into it. And I think that would go a long, not that we're not going to disagree, but it would go a long way to kind of disarming a lot of the more destructive impulses in our society.
Yeah. So you've touched on it a little bit, and I don't think that you can speak for, nor do you want to speak for Mr. Rogers in days like these, but you have some sense of what he might say to us. There's the iconic moment in his show where he puts his feet into a little pool with the black postman on his show. And it was a moving moment where he didn't really even have to say anything, but you could see it, that there's no difference, that their feet are feet, maybe a different color. We're still people, we're putting our toes in, we're having this conversation together. And that was one of his ways of talking about accepting all people, didn't matter who you were, that you matter. So when we look at what's happening now, and all kinds of really good discussions are happening because of this, and but also some destructive ones. One of the things that troubles me right now, speaking for us guys who are white guys, is there seems to be this white one-upping of other whites. Well, what you said is wrong, and you need to apologize. That apology wasn't good enough. And we seem to be doing a lot of looking at the racism in other white people rather than taking a moment to say, where am I culpable in this? And rather than having this gravitas that Mr. Rogers had, where you knew he loved you, and because he loved you, he could say, that's not good behavior. We've lost some of that. And we do a lot of our arguing and discussing now with just words on a Facebook page rather than heart to heart. So what do you think Fred Rogers would be thinking now, saying to us, to the best of your ability, knowing you're not speaking for him, but just what you know of him?
Well, with a lot of things, like with COVID and the suffering that went on with COVID, and for instance, the last time I talked to him was shortly after 9/11 in 2001. It's almost a cultural cliche now, where he would say, in times of trouble, look for the helpers.
Yes.
And with COVID, that was, an obvious perspective with doctors, nurses, first responders, grocery store clerks, etc. The kind of the heroism that we saw so broadly manifested. With the issue of race, I think it's slightly more complicated, I think, and he never took a controversial public stand about anything. He never engaged. He would talk about divorce, and he would talk about the way he addressed racism was by having this black person on the show and not saying a word about racism, really. And so it's a little more difficult to try to guess as to what his position would be now. My speculation is that he would be a great proponent for social justice.
Mm-hmm.
But again, he would not. I don't think he would fall prey to the scenario where what you just described. That he would not go around looking for people to blame or to feel better than or to accuse. He would, and Michael uses the Bodhisattva analogy. A spirit like that, without blaming, without engaging in that sort of stuff, he would just suffer.
Mm.
He would be sad to the world, for the world.
Mm.
And he would have compassion for the world.
Mm.
And always in the belief, I'm sure, that because of his own spiritual nature, that he knew that we were headed for better days, but that right now is just a very, very painful time.
Mm.
And he would open his bodhisattva's heart to the world, and just suffer with. I mean, I think Tim and I here, our theologies are similar in the fact that that God suffers with us in times of great travail.
Yeah.
Or Jesus suffers with us in times of great travail. And I think that that would be Fred's position, or Fred's natural inclination would just be to suffer in the most open and universal way, knowing that better days were coming.
Tim, that's such a profound statement. And Mr. Rogers came, he was a Presbyterian minister, so he came out of a Christian tradition, but who really embraced a number of different forms of spirituality. And Michael, he reminds me of you in that sense. You know, you're a Jewish man, and yet you have this affinity for a lot of different spiritual expressions. And one of the things, of course, that Christians and Jewish people share is the story of the Exodus, which we're actually using this weekend in our church service, where God speaks to Moses out of the burning bush and says, I have heard their cries. And I think that's part of what you're saying to us, Tim, is Mr. Rogers hears the cries, he suffers, and offers us this opportunity to love and to be kind. And Michael, I'm guessing for you, as someone who has really, you've lived in India, you've been in other places and interact with a lot of different kinds of people, that probably resonates with you as well, being a Jewish person and, being a part of a people who have suffered immense suffering for centuries.
Yeah, I'm listening to you guys, and it's, one can't help but have things resonate back to one's own probably primal nature. And while I have been all over and looked at all religions, it's not really a but. I mean, I've incorporated everything, I think. And my primal nature did start out Jewish. My genetic line is mainly Jewish and Catholic, but mainly Jewish. And I'm a practicing Jew. And when I think about these things, and with the George Floyd, and the racism and all of what we're working on, and what we're working on at grassroots levels, in schools, a number of us have been and continue to work on these issues at the grassroots. And the compassion and from Judaism, we have a phrase, repair the world. Why does a Jew exist? A Jew exists to repair the world, right? And we don't have a Messiah, right? We're still waiting for that Messiah. So don't have that Messiah. So we have to repair the world. So that's kind of that theology. And repairing the world is definitely, I definitely think that that's a mission shared by everyone in all religions. Right. And it's something that I'm really invested in at the level of doing. And when I think about all of what's going on, we have the pandemic, which you've referred to, of course, and then simultaneously we have what's going on with the protests. And I think I can understand what Tim's saying about Mr. Rogers. I think it's possible, and I'm not saying I speak for him, but I think it's possible that he would look at the world from that compassion standpoint and how do we repair the world standpoint, and would say, okay, some of this stuff is not appropriate, like looting and destroying, that I think he would say is not appropriate. But protesting and free speech and trying to repair the world and change the world and make life better for under resourced populations and racial issues, that is something that we need to do. And I can't speak for him, but I do think that that's a distinction that that people of that, like a bodhisattva, or people who look at the world from a spiritual point of view, at some point, I think that's where we all get to. We all get to the place where we do understand that rage and destruction does come from a place, and we can certainly understand the place it comes from, but it does not ultimately repair the world, and it does not ultimately solve these problems, like institutional racism, like over-incarceration of Black males, all of these issues that we have to solve. We have to solve them at a level both of compassion, and then we have to do something. And looting is not doing, in my opinion, but protesting is doing. I think that the free speech and the people expressing where they're at, and I don't know if he joined and you'd have to tell me, Tim Madigan, if he ever joined any of the peace marches. But when I was a kid, we were on a lot of peace marches, a lot of civil rights marches, and my parents were very into doing. We were going to get out there and do. They were both academics and anthropologists and a sociologist, and really stand with and do. And I don't know. You're kind of saying that maybe Mr. Rogers didn't go out and get involved in these things. But if he lived today, would he in fact want to do something? What do you think?
That's a really good question, and it's the one that, as I said earlier, I can't definitively answer. These other things I can guess pretty well at what he would say. I think there's and in terms of what you just said, I think that there's a very good likelihood, and again, I've qualified as you did that we don't know for sure. There's a very good likelihood that he would be fully behind the protests, the peaceful protests, the expressions that have come out, and the millions and millions of people. He was a very smart, insightful man. He was very well read and up to date, and very much based in this world. So I would think, there's at least a possibility that this is a situation where even Fred Rogers would come out and take a stand that would be unlike he might have addressed other situations, because it just, in my mind, it's just right. It's just right. Yeah. It's not even controversial. It's just right. It's an expression of the human heart. It's an expression of the human soul. And I think that given who he was, that he worked all his life to allow people to allow kids to grow up into the kind of human beings that they would be confident in their own spirits and their own beings, that they would be confident enough to express them in ways that didn't hurt other people. One of his songs, "What do you do with the mad you feel? Yes. When you feel so mad you could bite?" And okay, what do you do with the mad you feel now, in ways that is going to be constructive and healing and will repair the world? And I think he would have some suggestions for that, frankly. Yeah. So I mean, it's a more difficult question for me, because in past scenarios, it's always been fairly obvious what he would have done or said or thought. And this one takes a little bit more thought, a little bit more. But listening to you speak, I'm absolutely convinced that he would be a very calm and quiet and kind, but unmistakable voice for change in this country.
Yeah. Tim, we so appreciate your time with us, and I'm going to give you a moment here to think up one of your favorite Mr. Rogers stories. And so while you're thinking that, you probably already have it. This was a man of some remarkable moments, and I had a chance to watch this later on, actually just a couple weeks ago on YouTube, but where I think he was receiving an Emmy or a Lifetime Achievement Award, and he gets up in front of all of these TV people, and he says, "I want you to take 10 seconds, 20 seconds, whatever it was, to just right now quietly say thanks for the people who have made your life what it is." And he said, "I will watch the clock for you." And he takes out his little watch, which he did quite often. And just the reaction at first, people are sort of laughing, is this guy for real? And then the TV cameras catching people with just tears coming down their eyes as this Mr. Rogers guy, who's so unassuming and so anti really everything that Hollywood seems to be about, no pretenses at all. And he just gets up and he gives people a chance to say thank you in their hearts, and how deeply people were moved by that. And just the power that man had, because he was a loving, gracious man, which I think says so much. He reminds me a bit in that sense of Martin Luther King Jr., who just had that gravitas about him, probably a little bit more forceful personality, but boy, they both brought about that same kind of respect because they were loving people. So Tim, what's one of your favorite Mr. Rogers?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I can't remember if I shared this with your people when I was out there a year or two ago. But one of my favorite all-time stories was told to me by another friend of his named Bob Dursey. And Bob lived in Seattle, and Fred was out there visiting him. And one day, the two of them found themselves in a supermarket buying whatever they were buying. And so they get in line to check out. And there's a young man at the cash register. And when it's their turn to check out, the young man says, you look an awful lot like Fred Rogers. And Fred says, well, I am Fred Rogers. And the guy just freaks out. He said, oh my God. I said, my wife loves you. She's never going to believe that I met you. Oh, this is just perfect. So he said, well, do you have a phone? And the guy said, yeah, well, call your wife. And so he did. So, and so he hands the phone to Fred. And I can just imagine that the line is growing behind them, and Fred gets in. This woman was pregnant with their first baby, and hello, this is Fred Rogers. I understand you're with child. Good luck. I love you. Blah blah blah. And so he hangs up, and then Fred says, "Do you have a piece of paper?" And the guy says, well, yeah. So he says, write down your address. And when I get back to Pittsburgh, I'm going to send you something for the baby. And so he writes down his address, and Fred takes it in his very meticulous way, as he wants to do. He takes it and folds it up into this little piece of origami and takes out his wallet, opens up his wallet. And Bob said, there was like 100 other little pieces of paper in his wallet. And I know for a fact that when he got to Pittsburgh, he pulled out every one of those pieces of paper and found something and sent something, and was just as present in that act as he would have been, in all the times that he was with me. And so, I mean, he was playing in a different league as far as I'm concerned, and it would be great to. We missed him. Wish he was here to walk this part of the journey with us, but I think he will always be alive, and in so many different ways.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for your time. This has been great, and probably even better than doing it on a podcast, because we got to see your face as we're talking, and to see just how you light up when you talk about Mr. Rogers. And Michael, of course, thank you to you for your insights as always. And
well, thank you both. Yeah.
And for those of you who are interested, it's wonderofparenting.com, and that's where you can learn more about our podcast. And it's called The Wonder of Parenting, a brain science approach to parenting. And that's because we use Michael's brain and my questions to talk about parenting, and somehow it works. And
that's a good division of labor right there.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I get the easy part. So, Tim, blessings on you there. And I know you're heading into a really hot summer, as we're already in here in Phoenix. And Michael, thank you very, very much. And Tim, tell us one more time the name of your book and where people can get it.
It's called I'm Proud of You, My Friendship with Fred Rogers, and it's available on Amazon.
Perfect. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Take care. Bye-bye.